One of the main questions we get about tiny houses is where to park them. And unfortunately, tiny houses are illegal in a lot of places, whether that's because of zoning bylaws or other rules that limit the size of a building or that prevent people from living in buildings that are on wheels.
So if you're thinking of building a tiny house, or if you've already built one and you're thinking, where am I going to park this? Where am I going to live in it? Keep watching this video because we're going to talk about several different options.
Parking your tiny house on a piece of land that you've bought can be a really good option, but there's a few things that you'll want to check out to make sure it's legal first. Check with your municipality or your township to make sure that there's no minimum building size, because a lot of places do have that, and that's one thing that makes tiny houses illegal. Another thing is they might not allow a tiny house on wheels, so you'll want to find out if they have any specific bylaws about having a house on wheels. Another thing to look out for is that some places require you to have a well and or a septic tank if you're out in the country. These are all things that might affect your ability to park your tiny house on a piece of land that you own. So look into it first. To look into it, basically you're going to want to look up the bylaws or the zoning laws in your area. So to do that, most cities and towns have a website that lists their bylaws on them. So the first thing you can do is just visit your town's website and look up bylaws. They're really long documents sometimes and they can be really boring, so if you're having trouble finding the rules that you need, you can just contact your township office directly and ask them to point you in the right direction.
Tiny houses are very similar to RVs and camper trailers, so definitely check trailer parks, RV parks, and campsites, and some of them might allow long-term stays at reasonable prices. Some of these places have rules that specifically don't allow tiny houses for some crazy reason, so definitely check that ahead of time. A nice thing is that most of these places will have water hookups, electricity, and maybe even internet.
Even if it's not currently legal to park your tiny house in someone else's backyard, there may still be some loopholes that could make it work for you. One of them is if there's a caregiver provision in the bylaws that says that anyone who's taking care of someone who's living in their home can live in the backyard. So that might be an option. If you're going to take care of somebody, you could use that. Another one is if you're only going to be there part-time. So if it's a recreational vehicle or a vacation home, you may be allowed to live in it part-time in your backyard or in someone else's backyard. And a third option for parking in someone's backyard, even when tiny houses may not be legal, is if there is an accessory dwelling unit provision. So look into the rules and find out if your area allows for accessory dwelling units, which is basically just a secondary smaller house in the backyard of another home. Another great resource that we have found out about is the Tiny House Community website. They've got a list of every community and every town and city that is changing the rules about tiny houses. So you could look there and see if there's any communities or eco-villages or areas where tiny houses are becoming legal, and maybe you can consider moving there or at least looking into how those places are doing it so that you could try to apply the same thing to your area. It's a fantastic resource. I was really surprised when I found it to see how many communities and eco-villages were listed there, so definitely check it out. It's only going to keep growing. The website is tinyhousecommunity.com.
It's also exciting that some suburbs, some neighborhoods, and some eco-villages are being rezoned to allow people to live in tiny houses. So you would live in your tiny house just like you would in a normal house in a city or a town. You would pay taxes just like everybody else, except you would be living in a tiny house. So definitely check the area that you're interested in just to see if that is even an option. This is also something that you can check on tinyhousecommunity.com, and I'm also assuming that this is just going to get more and more popular.
Finding a place to park your tiny house may involve getting a little bit creative and maybe bending the rules. Some of the people that we've met who are living in their tiny houses didn't want to wait until their town or their city legalized tiny houses. So some people are just parking their tiny house in the backyard after talking to neighbors and sometimes the township to make sure that it'll be tolerated, but it's still not exactly legal. So there are people who are doing that. We also met one woman who put her tiny house on pontoons and turned it into a houseboat. And so now, because it's docked on the water, it doesn't really fit into any of the building codes or zoning laws in her area, so she's able to live on a tiny house on the water. Another person that we met has their tiny house and they don't have a piece of land to park it on full time, so instead they are property sitters, and instead of house sitting for somebody, they just bring their own house with them and live in their own house but on the property that they're taking care of. One last option that some people are choosing is just to put their tiny house wherever they want it, even if it's not legal. And obviously we don't recommend that because building a tiny house can be a huge investment and you don't really want to risk getting kicked out of your spot and not having anywhere to live in it. If you're really passionate about building a tiny house and living in a tiny house, you should definitely try to see if there's a community in your area that's already forming. Maybe there are people who are already working to change the laws, or you might have to be the pioneer who goes to your township office and asks what can be done to try and make tiny houses legal in your area.
I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. If you have any ideas or comments or other options that we didn't mention in the video, please add them to the comment section. And for anyone else, check out the comments also, and you might get even more ideas and content coming from there.
Thanks for watching. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and subscribe to see more like it.